Hey, welcome to the second part in this tutorial series for Viewmodel animation in Maya. In this video we're going to be getting our rigs referenced in, explaining and setting up constraints, and posing our hands so that we're ready to animate. Let's get started. To reference in our rigs, let's come up here to File, Create Reference, and navigate to wherever your arm rig is. If you're following along with the tutorial content folder, it's this control rig. Just reference that in and it'll pop into our scene. Remember, if it's facing up, you'll have to change your up axis and your preferences, just like I mentioned in the last video. We also want to get our gun into the scene, so let's create another reference and select our AK rig. If you toggle the viewport textures, you'll see our AK has the textures linked correctly, but our arms don't. If any textures don't show up for you, it's just a simple matter of going into the material and fixing the file path. That might be tricky though, because as you can see, I can't seem to select the arm meshes. That's because they're in their own display layer down here, and this third checkbox is set to R, which means you can see it but you can't select it. Just toggle that off and you'll be good to go. Or you can select the meshes straight from the outliner from inside their group. I'm just going to quickly change to these other sleeves since we've got some options. H will hide or unhide the current selection, so you can mix and match gloves, arms, and sleeves. A lot of rigs have multiple meshes, so you can get some pretty cool combinations. To repath the textures, select your mesh, then come over here to the attribute editor. Scroll along the top till you get to the material, then enter the color node and open up the folder. Navigate to wherever your textures are, in this case they're in a folder along with the rig, and choose the relevant file. You can see in the attribute editor we want the janitor top D, D meaning diffuse, so let's grab that. Do the same for the hands and we're good to go. Now let's make sure this gun is the correct size. If you're at a studio, the rigs would be all properly scaled, but when you're working with meshes from online, chances are they're not going to match up. Just going to bring the gun forward and down a little bit. Then if you come up to panels, orthographic, then side, we can get a nice flat look at everything. I'm moving the right wrist up and positioning it roughly near the grip so we can check the scale. This is where references come in handy. Feel free to research what a hand looks like holding your particular gun and how big they are in relation to each other. Just based on how much of the grip is visible below the pinky, I think somewhere around 0.9 scale seems to do the trick. Let's switch back to perspective view and I'll quickly reset that wrist to 0 in the channel box. Alright, constraints. They can be a little confusing and overwhelming when you're not used to them, but trust me, once you get the hang of it, it's a breeze. I know we did some simple parenting when we made the AK rig in the last video, but let me explain it more clearly with these two cubes. To create a constraint, you select the parent, also known as the driving object, first, and then the child or the driven object. Making sure we're in the rigging menu set, come up to constraint and open up the options box. Maintain offset means either the child will snap to the parent, like so, or it will stay where it is. You can also make the constraint only work on certain axes if you want, but for now, let's just add it and see what happens. If we move around the parent, you'll see that the child follows, which is great, but check out what happens when we put the child somewhere else and then move it. It snaps back, and if you try to animate it, you'll find even if it has keyframes, it'll still snap back. The problem is, since it's a node-based child rather than a hierarchical child that we could make by just dragging it into the parent and the outliner, Maya reckons that we want it to be always locked. To get its freedom back, we'll need to place the child into a group. So let's just open this up and delete the constraint that we created and hit Ctrl G to group it. I'll give it a rename, and now we can go ahead and make a new constraint, this time between the parent and the group. Now the child is free to move around, but since the group it's in is constrained, we get the exact same behavior. You almost always want to constrain to a group, and properly made rigs should have plenty that their controls are in that you can work with. So what if I want to turn off the constraint? If you select either the group or the constraint node itself, you can see in the channel box the name of the parent and its value. Setting it to 0 will turn it off, so you can keyframe this throughout the animation to get whatever effect you want. In the next video about animating a reload, we'll show you that workflow and how to deal with the teleporting you'll probably run into while trying to change spaces. Jumping back over to our scene, let's set up our constraints. We're going to start with the right wrist, which should follow the gun all the time, since for most animations it will stay holding the grip. So I'm going to select the wrist, but remember we want to constrain the group above it, so if you come over to the outliner and press F, it'll focus in on where our control is. We can just select the right wrist group. Remember to get the parent first, so the main gun control, then the group, and create a constraint. I just have a button for it on my own shelf, but it's also over in the rigging tab or in the menu up top. So now that's working as intended, looking good. Next, let's get the left wrist to follow the mags, so we can reload easily. I find it's much better than having the mag follow the hand, which is what you might instinctively want to do. Mag control, left wrist group, and parent. Do the same for the other mag, and then we can go into the constraint and just set the second mag to 0 for now. If you have multiple constraints set to 1 at the same time, the child will half and half follow the different parents. Finally, we'll make the mags follow world space, so we can turn that on whenever we want to throw them or do something independent of the gun. What I'd like to do is create a locator as a reference for world space, so I'll add that and rename it. I'll also hide it since we never need to see it. Locator, then mag group, and parent. The same for the second mag. Now you'll see that they no longer follow the gun, which is sweet. But let's set the main mag back to 0 for the time being. Now we'll be able to do a ton of sweet sequences with the freedom of space switching that these constraints give us. I'm going to hand over the rest of the video to my good friend Hayden Cooper, one of the talented animators over at Respawn. They'll walk you through some posing of the hands and fingers, so you'll get an awesome first person view holding the gun.
Hello, I'm Hayden, and I'll be going over some posing exploration with the rig provided. Really quick, I'm going to move the right hand up onto the grip just to move it out of the way from default pose, and we'll be returning to this later. Let's focus on the left hand now. Getting the left hand, and in particular the thumb of the left hand's idle pose to look the way you want it can be one of the trickier things of setting up an idle pose. How you set this up defines the character of who is holding the weapon. If the grip is tight and follows the contour of the weapon, it can imply that the character has fired this weapon before, it's familiar, possibly an operator. To imply that your character is weak, inexperienced, or unfamiliar, you might have a break in the line from the arm to the wrist, or there might be some gaps in the thumb posing. I'm going to get a rough posing on the 4 fingers gripping the handguard here, just to get a rough idea for how this hand is going to be holding the weapon. We'll be primarily focusing on the thumb and the shape of the thumb silhouette. Avoid having the fingers peek over the handguard because it can imply the hand isn't properly gripping the weapon, or it can detract from your silhouette, possibly making the viewer start to question, what is that peeking over? The base joints of your fingers are going to have a bit more flexibility in the rotations that they can do, while your top 2 joints are going to be pretty limited to the parallel axes for curling up and down. And on this pose here, I'm going to be flexing the metacarpals for the ring finger slightly and the pinky the most to really get that feeling of the hand curling into the handguard. For applying pressure on the fingers gripping down on something, you can go for a C shape where it feels like the tip of the fingers are pressing down, or you can go for a hyperextension where it's a bit more of a opposite curve going on and the tip of the fingers bending up. But I would reserve that for situations where you want to show a lot of pressure for a short amount of time versus the curled C. The posing on these guys don't have to be perfect. Our main focus is going to be the hand and the thumb. We can readjust the posing on this later. Now for tackling the thumb, I have 2 quick go-tos for exploring whenever I'm setting up a idle pose. The first is that C shape where the base of the thumb and the second or middle joint of the thumb are a bit stronger, a bit straighter, and I'm really pushing the curve in on the last edge of the thumb, getting more pressure with the tip of the thumb happening here. I'll call that the C shape. And if you want to apply pressure being from the base of your thumb tip, you would rotate that up, your middle joint in a bit, and some extra adjustments to the base of the thumb to support that. And I'll call this the S shape because of the zigzagging line that's being created. You may need to adjust the angle of the wrist for it to support it and look okay. What I like about these shapes is that they have a more interesting silhouette, and having a more defined silhouette typically brings out the appeal of your hand pose. Cool, now that is looking okay. We can move on to our right hand. Some things I'm thinking about as I pose the right hand is getting a good angle, the top-down view of the right hand, making sure the angle isn't pushed too far right or too far left. And same goes with the relationship on the base finger joints and the middle finger joints. And getting a relationship that feels like it's gripping it, but not overextending itself. On things to avoid, you want to make sure that your fingers aren't equally spread out, and when gripping something, your fingers are going to want to bring it closer to your palm. So you're going to want that palm to really be grabbing what it is instead of having it further out there and then all the work being done by the last 2 joints of your fingers. And lastly is the index finger, and positioning in a way that feels correct with the shooting doctrine that you are implying. Once I have the right hand's pose all noodled, I will move on to the weapon and start exploring some different options. The way that you present the weapon in screen space can say a lot about how powerful it is, where the weapon is assumed to be in relationship to the person holding it, if it's seated in their shoulder or if it's down at their hip, if it's a more casual pose or like a tactical canted pose. Regardless of what pose you're going for, it's all about creating a clear line from the base of your weapon to your target, which is your crosshair. Another thing to think about is the silhouette and defining the shapes and the parts and pieces of the weapon so it is immediately recognizable. Typically, a more powerful weapon is going to take up more screen space, while a weaker weapon takes up less space. Getting a weapon closer to the horizon line is another way to imply that the weapon is more powerful because it's taking up more of your screen space. A lot of iconic sniper rifle poses will be brought up and obscure the player's vision more. For gameplay purposes, you don't want to obstruct the player's vision too much, especially around the crosshair. If that area is blocked too much and for too long, it'll start to alter player behavior because they want to look away in order to maintain their eyes on what's going on, which will in turn break their immersion that you're trying to sell to them. When an idle pose is too centered, I think it takes away from the unique silhouette that each weapon has. That applies mostly to rifles and two-handed weapons. Some games get around this by going for a full cant, where the weapon is lowered and you start to see the right side of the gun. If you're going to go down this route, I highly recommend exploring a unique pose. In particular, thumb over bore C-clamp works well, pushing the idea that the person shooting this weapon is an operator trained in this particular shooting doctrine. When exploring idle poses, I like to make a couple where I'm translating it, I'm rotating it clockwise, counterclockwise, just to give me a few options to where I'm not putting all of my eggs into one basket that I think looks good at that moment. You might return to it and get some different opinions, or you might show it to your peers or your lead and they have some different ideas, and it's much easier and more flexible to have a few different things to pick and choose from. You can noodle posing ideas for days, but once you get something you like, I recommend just jumping into the animation and start going. You can always adjust the idle poses later. That wraps up what I have to say about idle posing. I hope this is helpful, and thank you so much for watching.
Hey, it's me again. I just wanted to cover something really quickly which will save you a lot of hassle when you get into animation, and that is rotation orders. So we could do some posing and rotate the gun around it, and the axes are all aligned, which is fine and dandy, but the problem is Maya uses Euler rotation. So if you hold Control, Shift, and right click, there's a couple other ways to get to this, by the way. You can see we're in object mode. You can also go to world if you want to do some world rotating, and we have gimbal here. So if I rotate the y-axis, you can see here, we'll actually get the other two axes locked, which is no good. That's because the axes follow a hierarchical system. So we don't want that, and especially if you go to animate and suddenly something in the graph editor is not lining up with your object rotation manipulator, you're like, what's going on? This doesn't make sense. So if we come over here to the attribute editor, we've got our rotate order drop down here. We can see all the different options. And when you're just setting up the idle pose, it's good to play around and see, what'll work best for your animation that you're planning, for specific posing, to make sure you get the least gimbal lock. I always find that it's nice to have the barrel as the first, and then the pitch, and then the yaw. I just find that that's best for posing, but obviously you can use whatever works for you. So for me, that would be ZXY. So I can get some nice barrel rolls independent of everything else. I can pitch the gun up and I can still get barrel rolls, and then I can yaw it in any direction, and I've still got nice up and down motion, and I've still got some nice barrel rolls. This will be especially noticeable if you've got the wrong rotation order when you import the gun and it's facing a different way. So you do some posing, and then suddenly by default it'll be facing the right way with the hands, but two of the axes will be aligned in a bad way. So just make sure that you check the gimbal of your gun when you're setting things up, and that will save a lot of headache in the future when you're animating. Hopefully everything we've covered in this video is enough for you to get set up and prepared and ready to animate in Maya. Next video will be doing a reload and covering all the different steps and processes that we do to create it. Thanks for watching.